Hey, deserving listeners, 90 Day Fiancé. Let's check it out.
Is he really serious?
Pero Yohan, ella nos está contando que ella paga la renta.
Ella paga todo con el dinero que yo le doy. ¿Por qué ella no dice eso? Sí, porque nos dividimos mitad y mitad de la renta y de todo. Ella no, que no se llene la boca hablando que ella paga todo, que ella paga todo.
Danielle, is that true? Do you guys split things 50-50?
No.
Okay, so there's not a lot to comment on thus far, but the relationship between Danielle and Yohan is continuing, which I didn't expect. They both were saying there are good days and bad days. They're currently not in the same country. I can't remember the details on that, but there's been some talk about how, and I will say, Danielle, a side note, in reaction to a lot of people, the other cast members, has a very healthy point of view. I think Tim and Veronica similarly, but the reactions that Danielle often has, I'm thinking, yeah, someone should say this. And often there isn't anyone to say these kinds of things on the cast. And hearing Danielle say those things, I'm like, oh, that's good. I remember having a similar feeling about Stephanie of Stephanie and Erica. Stephanie would often, if I remember right. Anyway, so they're talking about this, and the long and the short of it is that they had Talon on to the stage, which I think triggered him. And there are a lot of people yelling at Danielle for emasculating him, and just all that talk about power and control. Danielle said something that I thought was probably accurate, depending on what she means by it. But she's like, we end up fighting about particular topics, but really the problem is communication. But so at least it's more in the direction of probably the way I would see it. I often will kind of joke around how literally every couple that comes into my office says that they want to work on communication. And it's like, it's like saying, we're here to work on our relationship. Well, what's wrong with your relationship? Well, our relationship is wrong with our relationship. Because, communication is the relationship. So, it's just the way that we don't have a lot of awareness around attachment and reactivity and trauma and schemas and that kind of thing. Of course, that's just the way I see things. But anyway, so she was saying that, but we still saw a continuation of Danielle infantilizing him and putting him down, saying that he's basically worthless in business. And she didn't say that directly, but she was saying it not even necessarily indirectly, and just that whole thing about who's in control. And I think when they're left to their own devices and they're not being triggered and they're not being observed, then they actually, I think, have a lot of good times. But I think for him, now that and maybe for her too, now that there's a lot of scrutiny, a lot of observation, a lot of eyes on them, they're both trying to establish that they're the ones in control. And she kind of started it. Talon came on, but then he really just started to say a lot of things that were indicative of someone that I tend to believe Danielle here, that she pays for most of the bills. And I think for him, there was that whole he wanted to drive thing. And I think he just has a really hard time with, I don't know what to say, gender power politics. And whenever there's any kind of threat there, and I think he even mentioned he has some trauma around that, but still, he really swings hard into Danielle, and I think there's a possibility he's just literally making something up right now. Now, it's possible that Danielle is too, but of Danielle's problems, I don't think lying just straight up is one of those things, and I don't think he is either, but I think he's just, given his profile, I think more likely to say something like this, given his seeming sensitivity to quote-unquote being emasculated. My whole thing as a man, as a masculine identifying man, I just don't understand the whole idea of emasculation. She even said something that was really brilliant. She's like, people were saying, you've emasculated him, you've taken away his masculinity. And she's like, I don't believe anyone, myself included, has the ability to take away someone's masculinity. And yeah, because if he were confident in himself, not as a man, but as a human being who also identifies as a man, then there wouldn't really be the vulnerability there, right? If if you're that fragile, and of course that's why people get in fights on the street when you call someone out, because not because they're super confident necessarily, but because they're not confident. You know, when people are calling me out, well, I'm not going to say I'm not going to get triggered, but generally speaking, if someone calls me out, and they call me, you know, some sort of emasculating names, which you could imagine that what they are, I don't regard their opinion of me. And plus, even if I did have the qualities that they think that they think I have, that doesn't make me a bad person. You know, calling me a woman or a girl or a pussy or something, it's just like, okay, well, what do you mean? Am I supposed to take that personally? Am I also supposed to believe that you have done a thorough personality inventory of me? And I'd love to see the report that your conclusions are based on. And literally, I've had conversations like that before, because, you know, it just, at the very least, it's just something to say in a situation like that. But anyway, so I think he's feeling insecure. He feels like he's being emasculated. She was being hurtful. Taylor comes on, and then he just starts going. And now he's saying, we're done. And even though prior to being triggered, he was saying that their relationship is ongoing. Not that it doesn't have this conflict, but it seemingly was hitting kind of a homeostasis point. But yeah, I think he's really prone to being hurt this way. And I think that's what happened when she came that first time to DR, and she was that way, and then he came out swinging the next time she came down. So I think it's happening again. And what she will conclude, which isn't necessarily wrong, is that he's a misogynistic, abusive person and toxic, as they say, and thus I shouldn't be with him. But I think if they had someone there helping them, perhaps a man to help him with masculinity. As a man, I benefit from being able to speak man to man with men in situations like this, and able to, because if a woman talks to him as a if a couple therapist, not that they can't do that, of course, but it can often be hard to convince. It's easier for me to convince. It's easier for me to say, look, you're a man, I'm a man, I get it. We're here, we're talking about things, and I imagine that she's triggering you right now, and I would feel that way too. And let's slow down and let's recognize that we're, what the bigger picture here is, and what are you feeling on the inside, instead of coming at her and rejecting her, because I'm guessing he feels hurt. I'm guessing he feels hurt, and he has a hard time talking about that. Hey, deserving listeners, today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes in life, we are faced with tough choices, and the path forward isn't always clear. And some of you might even be facing a tough choice right now. Well, for me, I like to fully explore all the options. That usually helps me to feel more confident moving forward. And sometimes it really helps to talk with someone and get their perspective and maybe their wisdom. And of course, therapy can help with this. I never planned on specializing in this area when I started out as a therapist, but over time, a lot of clients have come to me when they are facing tough choices that they're having a hard time figuring out what to do. Well, one option worth exploring is BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, it's worth giving a try. It's entirely online, it's designed to be convenient and suited to your schedule, and also you can switch therapists at any time at no additional charge. So, let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/Kirk today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/Kirk.
Everything 50
Well.
I think he wants to appear like he has power in a situation because he feels humiliated.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like maybe Danielle, post being filmed in the interim between then and now, that she might have gathered some helpful conceptualizations. The other thing I'll point out is that at some point she was saying, because there was this talk about their power struggles, and she was saying something like, you know what, if it comes down to it, fine, I'll give up all control. I will completely succumb to everything that he is. And the cast members were like, and I remember having that feeling towards her as well, that it's not all or nothing. And a lot of the cast members were like, it's about mutual respect. It's about showing up for each other. It's not about power. It's about being with each other and giving to each other equally. And that seemed to go over Danielle's head a little bit because I think of her history, not only her relationship history, but maybe her childhood as well. I don't know. But there's a chance that she's literally never been in a relationship where there wasn't a power differential. And I had this conceptualization that given her the way she talks, she sees herself as being victimized in the past, which isn't a guarantee that she was the one that was being victimized. At the very least, that's how she sees things. That's her narrative. And I could see that happening as well. And she did, because she talked about in her past relationship, she was the one paying for everything. And she's doing it again. And it's just like, well, what's the common denominator here? And is it necessary? Because now that we're seeing an example of, because if they break up, she will likely see it as him being a dominant, abusive person. And she will be in denial of her participation in the humiliating behavior that she exhibits, and the putting him down, and the infantilizing him, and the assumption that he's an idiot. Even if your partner is incompetent in something, there's a way to approach it that's very different from the way Danielle approaches it, like the whole meat shop scene. It's just like, even if you detect like, ooh, I think there's some incompetence here, why would anyone assume that, given that you're in a different country with different customs? And do you suddenly know a bunch about meat packing and processing? It didn't seem like she did. Certainly if you compare it to the typical American butcher shop, yeah, it looks a lot different, but there's a lot of different, things around, ways of doing things around the world. Anyway, so even if you saw like some obvious problems with budgeting or something, and I would have too. I think I even said this at the time when Danielle was reacting against, like, you don't have any records of anything. You don't have records of expenses, and one, like, how do you pay taxes? Do they pay taxes? Because you pay taxes on profit, right? Anyway, so I would have that concern as someone who loves Excel. Maybe Danielle does as well. I love Excel. I've loved Excel for 30 years. Whenever I have a problem, I go to Excel, or a spreadsheet, some sort. And but there's a different way to say it. Just like, hey, would you like help with this? Hey, do you mind if I kind of get my hands on some of the records? I just want to see if I might be able to help here. I don't know. But you have it figured out. Maybe you have a system in your head, and you seem to be doing okay. But there's a million other ways to say it. That's not how she did it, though. She was unrelentingly humiliating to him and putting him down and making him feel like an idiot and being sarcastic, and it was really awful. And that was just one example. There were others that we saw, and there were probably countless others, but not in front of the camera, seemingly. So I think she will be in denial of that, but there's a possibility that that's literally how she sees intimate relationships, that someone has to be the overfunctioner, someone has to be in control, which might have even attracted her to him in the first place. There were markers that somehow indicated that dynamic would happen, that money dependency would happen, or visa dependency would happen, and therefore she would be in control. And also being with someone that is coming from a very macho culture and having that constant battle, it's just set up for that, right? So who knows? But it is interesting to think about.
I feel like I have no idea who I'm going to get when I walk off the stage. He's never really learned how to have a healthy relationship. So it's like I have to either be unbelievably patient.
So you hear the language? She says earlier that it's a communication problem, which it seems like it's an equal thing. And then she is speaking this way. It'd be one thing to say he has issues with humiliation. It's another thing to say the way she phrased it, that he's basically a child, he's completely incompetent, it has nothing to do with me, I'm 100% perfect, and it's always his problem. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if when she was young, she was blamed for everything, and she had someone like Yohan, but times 100 in her life, her father or something. Because when I see people that are like this, that are so averse to exploring their own responsibility, often they were blamed too much. They were blamed for things, and they're walking around, and I think I might have hypothesized this about her, that who knows, but there's a possibility that she walks around with so much shame and so much certainty that she's to blame for everything, but at the same time angry that she's always being blamed for everything. And so she's real busted up about it, that the behavioral presentation is this, where everyone else is to blame.
And just not let myself get impacted by it, or I have to leave him.
Now, I want to be clear. His behavior during the tell-all is atrocious. So her being upset and calling it out and saying that he has a problem, seemingly of lying now as well, it is accurate. So I'm not going to take that away from her for sure.
I am always going to fight for my marriage. Like, I love my husband very much. Like, we're both very emotional, and we both say things we don't mean when we're angry, and we both need to work on that. But we're both coming into this relationship with so much trauma that we need someone to help us work through it. And I'm hoping that I can convince him to consider therapy.
Yeah, so maybe after she's less triggered, she can talk in a way that we both have issues. She has yet to, on camera, in terms of the edit anyway, admit any of her trauma that she is reacting to. So, but maybe she's aware of it. Who knows? And yeah, I agree with everything she just said. I didn't show the clip, but he said, I don't want to go to therapy. Maybe he's just being triggered as well. But he said, therapy doesn't work here. And I would imagine that what he is thinking is that at least American-style therapy, or if there's a female therapist, then they won't understand or value his point of view. And that isn't necessarily true, and it's not like a male therapist would necessarily either. But if I were to recommend to them, I would recommend that they find a therapist and try to vet a therapist, regardless of gender, but it might end up being a man, who can speak to the issues that Yohan is concerned with, more traditional gender role issues, without just completely discounting them, right? Because it wouldn't be unusual if you just grabbed an average couple therapists in the United States that they would see things very similar to the way Danielle does, without trying to bridge the gap and just labeling him as a toxic male, as a misogynist, as a sexist, as regressive, and he needs to change. And certainly there are elements of that, 100%. But how do you work with that? And also, are there bits and pieces of Yohan's adherence to masculinity that can be retained so you can actually keep him in therapy, or at least make it appealing to him, And also just valuing his identity as a masculine male. So those therapists aren't, in my anecdotal experience, extremely common. So, that there is that. But even if you did find a therapist like that, there's a chance that he still wouldn't go, because men, and particularly men from these kinds of cultures, macho cultures, regardless of the therapist, they will never go, because it's too emasculating to them to ask for help or to put themselves up for scrutiny or something. It's too vulnerable. And so it might be impossible anyway. But, maybe we'll see them on that couple therapy show. Okay, well, let's adjourn there. And everyone, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really, really do.